Right now, in the deep quiet of this evening, you may be experiencing a cold, hollow ache that feels entirely invisible to the world outside your window. Maybe you came to this space tonight because you are carrying a profound sense of isolation, feeling fundamentally unseen by the people who occupy the same streets, the same workplaces, or even the same rooms as you. There is an incredibly heavy, exhausting sorrow that arrives when you are surrounded by a crowded world, yet feel as though you are watching life unfold from behind a thick, unyielding pane of glass. You might look at the interactions of others and feel a quiet, structural desolation in your chest, an unexamined conviction that you are an outsider to the human circle, stranded on a solitary shoreline, while the rest of humanity shares a warmth that somehow avoids you. Let the mattress receive the full, raw weight of your isolation tonight, noticing how the chilly autumn air drifts over your face, carrying the damp, earthy scent of decaying leaves and wet mountain stones. The room around you has fallen into a deep stillness. The frantic demands of the daytime have dissolved, yet inside your mind, you may still be frantically trying to patch together a broken fortress of expectations, trying to repair the paper-thin walls of your identity so the draft of loneliness cannot get in. You are not broken because you feel this deep disconnect. What you are experiencing right now is not a personal failure, but the natural, painful constriction of a sensitive heart that has mistaken its protective boundaries for a cage. Tonight, we will not force your mind to invent a false sense of belonging, nor will we demand that you banish the ache of your solitude. We are simply going to rest by the edge of an ancient wilderness pavilion, learning how to take down the torn screens of our self-defense so the night wind can pass through us without finding anything. To break, the mind does not escape from loneliness by frantically seeking a crowd or by forcing the rest of the world to validate its presence. True, inner liberation begins with a surprising insight from Buddhist psychology. Your painful isolation is not caused by an absence of people around you, but by the rigid, invisible walls your own ego builds to keep the world separate from yourself. When we feel unseen, our natural reaction is to retreat deeper into our own thoughts, constructing paper-thin screens of judgment, defense, and expectation to shield our vulnerability from further hurt. But this hypervigilant architecture creates a profound psychological paradox. The very walls we put up to keep out the cold are what trap our loneliness inside, locking us into a tiny suffocating chamber where we can only hear the echo of our own perceived unworthiness. Loneliness is not an empty desert that proves you are unlovable. It is simply the doorway back to your own inner temple, a sacred space that can only be entered when you stop trying to seal yourself out of reality. Take a slow, completely unhurried breath in through your nose, letting the cool evening air expand the very base of your abdomen, and let it go with a long, soft sigh through your lips, making absolutely no effort to control the quiet stillness that follows. Right now, dear friend, nothing is required of you. No social puzzles must be unraveled, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight. You are entirely safe enough to soften the small defensive tension around your eyes, to let your jaw drop slightly away from your teeth, and to give up the exhausting struggle of proving your existence to a world that is currently asleep. In a moment, this journey will take us to a high, rocky ridge where an old temple keeper lives in a structure with no doors, showing a lonely cartographer why a wind whistle only sings when it is entirely hollow. This story will show us a quieter way to meet our emptiness, offering a gentle path into an unconfined peace where the self loses its boundaries and the body can finally drop into rest. For many years, a young mapmaker named Kalen had lived in a state of quiet, agonizing exile, traveling through the borderlands of the mountain provinces to record the precise edges of valleys, rivers, and ridges. His work required him to understand boundaries, to draw lines that separated one territory from another. But inside his own heart, those lines had become a cold, impenetrable labyrinth. Kalen felt completely severed from the human warmth of the villages. He charted. He would sit in the corner of crowded taverns, watching travelers laugh and share bread, while feeling an unyielding weight in his chest, convinced that he was fundamentally different from them, a solitary spectator destined to remain forever, invisible to his peers. He had spent his whole adulthood measuring distances, but the greatest, most terrifying distance was the one that separated his own soul from the rest of existence. Every evening, when the night fog came down over his temporary camps, Kalen would lie awake on his mat, his chest tightening, as the heavy echo of his isolation walked through his thoughts. He spent his nights trying to preserve his comfort, using his detailed parchment maps to block the small drafts that whistled through the cracks of his wooden travel trunk, as if sealing out the air could somehow protect his fragile peace. His internal world had become like a tightly sealed box, rigid and defensive, terrified of the vast emptiness of the mountains, yet suffocating beneath the weight of its own unwashed boundaries. He was profoundly tired, but the habit of tracking his separateness refused to grant his mind even a single hour of undisturbed rest. One chilly autumn night, when a sudden, freezing gale swept through the high mountain pass, Kalen found himself stranded on a jagged, barren ridge, far from any village or inn. The wind howled through the dry bamboo groves like a chorus of grieving spirits, and the cold mist bit sharply into his cheeks. As he stumbled along the rocky path, his fingers numb from gripping his leather map case. Just as the darkness became absolute, he came upon a dilapidated, thatch-roofed wilderness pavilion built directly into the stone cliff face, overlooking a vast black sea of forest canopy below. The structure was ancient and entirely exposed to the elements. Its paper shoji screens had completely frayed and decayed over decades of abandonment, leaving only the bare, silvered skeleton of the cedar posts standing against the stormy sky. Sitting on the rough timber floor of this wallless shelter, beside a small iron charcoal brazier that cast a fragile amber glow into the fog, was an elderly temple keeper named Master Hobben. The old man was dressed in a simple, coarse robe that had faded to the color of wet slate, and his rough hands were slowly, deliberately, arranging pieces of dry pine wood in the embers. He did not possess a door, he did not possess walls, and he did not look up in surprise when the shivering cartographer emerged from the mountain mist. He simply gestured with a slight, unhurried tilt of his chin for Kalen to sit near the warmth of the fire, while the immense, roaring gale passed directly through the center of the pavilion, rattling the remaining fragments of thatch, but leaving the heavy cedar beams completely unbothered. Kalen knelt by the brazier, his teeth chattering, his arms wrapped tightly around his torso as he tried to pull his wool cloak into an impenetrable shield against the draft. The air smelled of damp pine needles, cold granite, and the rich, grounded scent of wood ash. A sensory world, so vast and indifferent that it made Kalen's internal isolation feel incredibly small, yet intensely painful. He looked around, open pavilion with a mixture of misery and frustration, wondering why anyone would choose to live in a shelter that offered no protection from the mountain storm, where the wind could strike the skin from every direction. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter. But as Kalen sat there in the damp chill, his own rapid breathing began to slow, caught by the steady, unbothered posture of the old man who sat in the center of the gale. And this is where the mind begins to soften. The charcoal fire clicked softly, releasing a tiny, bright spark that drifted upward into the grey mist before vanishing against the dark underside of the thatched roof. Kalen sat perfectly still, his knees pressed against the cold timber planks of the floor, his hands still numbly gripping the edges of his leather map case. Across the small iron brazier, Master Hobben remained unmoving, his weathered hands resting loosely on his lap, his breathing so deep and rhythmic that it seemed to belong to the mountain itself rather than a human frame. Between them the wind surged continuously, an invisible river of cold air that swept over the rocky ridge, howling through the open frame of the pavilion, where the paper shoji screens had long since rotted away. Kalen felt an old, familiar desolation rising within his throat. Even here, sitting within arm's reach of another living being, the invisible pane of glass that separated him from the rest of the world felt completely impenetrable. He was sharing the warmth of the same fire, yet he felt entirely marooned inside his own skin, trapped in the cold conviction that his presence was unnoticed, his exhaustion unshared, and his life completely detached from the quiet peace that the old temple keeper seemed to inhabit. The open pavilion offered no protection, and every gust of the mountain storm felt like a personal assault on his fragile, shivering body, a vivid reminder of how exposed and lonely he truly was in the vastness of the borderlands. Unable to bear the freezing draft any longer, Kalen unbuckled his leather case with trembling fingers and pulled out several thick sheets of heavy parchment maps. These were his life's work, covered in meticulous, dark ink lines that recorded every ridge, boundary and frontier he had spent years charting. He leaned forward, his teeth clicking in the damp chill, and tried to press the stiff edges of the parchment against the wide gap between two silvered cedar posts where the wind was blowing hardest. He thought that if he could just wedge the thick paper tightly enough into the wood, he could create a temporary shield, a small boundary to seal out the emptiness of the night sky and find a moment of artificial warmth. But the mountain gale was too immense for his boundaries. The moment he pressed the maps against the posts, the wind slammed into the rigid paper with a loud, aggressive rattle. The parchment resisted the force for a few seconds, bending and buckling under the strain, until the intense pressure tore the thick sheets cleanly from Kalen's numb fingers, ripping the edges and scattering his beautifully drawn lines into the dark forest below. Kalen let out a sharp, ragged breath, his shoulders tightening near his ears, as he stared at his empty hands, his heart sinking into a deeper, bitter layer of self-reproach. His defenses had broken, his charts were gone, and the cold mist rushed back into his face, more aggressive than before. Master Hobben did not move to help him, nor did he offer a word of pity for the lost maps. Instead, the old temple keeper reached slowly into the deep, faded fold of his wool sleeve and withdrew a small, unpolished object. It was a simple wind whistle, fashioned from a small, completely hollowed out, dried gourd, its tan skin weathered and rough from years of exposure to the mountain air. At each end of the gourd, small, round holes had been cleanly bored into the shell, leaving the interior entirely empty, a tiny hollow chamber that carried no weight and possessed no internal structure. The old man did not speak. He merely held the small gourd whistle out in his open palm, letting it rest in the direct path of the freezing gale that was still roaring through the wall-less pavilion. The moment the wind struck the open holes of the shell, it did not push the gourd away, nor did it break its dry skin. Instead, as the storm rushed completely through the empty chamber, a deep, hauntingly beautiful note arose from the wood, a clear, resonant sound that vibrated through the mist, blending perfectly with the howling of the gale, turning the violent assault of the storm into a long, soothing melody that filled the mountain ridge. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter. Master Hobben turned his weathered face toward Kalen, his eyes reflecting the soft amber glow of the dying charcoal embers. He reached out and placed the hollow gourd whistle gently onto the mapmaker's open leather case, letting it rest right where the rigid parchment sheets had been just moments before. "Why do you think the wind tears your thick maps to pieces?" Hobben asked, his voice low and raspy, carrying the slow, deliberate cadence of the valley stream. Yet it passes through this fragile shell, without leaving a single scratch behind. Kalen looked down at the small gourd, his fingers tracing the rough, uncarved edges of the open holes, his mind still racing with the habitual overthinking of his loneliness, tried to find a complex, geographical answer. He replied that his maps were large and flat, offering a wide surface for the storm to strike, while the gourd was small and round, allowing the wind to slip past its edges. The old temple keeper shook his head slowly, a faint, gentle smile appearing in the deep lines around his mouth. "The maps are torn because they are rigid, closed, and full of boundaries," the old man whispered, his breath rising like a thin plume of white steam in the cold air. "Your parchment tries to stand against the storm, trying to build a wall where there are no walls. And so the wind has no choice but to break it. But look at this little gourd. It survives the gale because it has no interior to defend. It is entirely hollow. When the freezing wind strikes it, the air does not find a barrier to fight against it, enters one side and exits the other, passing completely through its core. The gourd does not try to seal out the emptiness of the mountain. It allows the night to move through its heart, and in that complete surrender, its emptiness is transformed into a song." Kalen knelt on the damp timber floor, his gaze fixed on the hollow dark inside the dried shell. For many years, he had believed that his deep, aching loneliness was a structural defect in his soul, a personal failure that he had to fix by building stronger walls, by sealing himself away in his own thoughts, or by desperately searching for a crowd to validate his existence. He had used his isolation as a shield, treating the vast, silent world around him as an invading enemy that he had to protect his vulnerability against. But looking at the small whistle, a sudden, overwhelming wave of recognition washed over his chest, loosening the tight muscles around his ribs. He realized that the people of the villages had not cast him out. He had cast himself out by trying to use his boundaries to seal his heart away from reality. He had been lying awake for hundreds of nights, inside a prison of his own architectural design, providing the rigid paper walls that turn the natural space of the universe into a suffocating cage of separation. He had been fighting the wind with paper, hurting himself with his own resistance, while the world was simply asking him to open his doors. Kalen let his hands drop softly onto his knees, his posture relaxing away from his ears for the first time since he had climbed the ridge as the immense, roaring storm continued to pass entirely through the wallless house, finding nothing left to break. And this is where the mind begins to soften. The deep resonance of the hollow gourd wind whistle leaves a quiet vibration in the damp mountain air, hanging between the silvered cedar posts long after the old temple keeper has gone silent. As you lie here in the shadows of your own room, let the imagery of that wallless ridge pavilion settle slowly into your awareness. This ancient narrative is not telling us to stop feeling our profound human needs, nor is it asking us to become cold, detached stone statues who look down on the ache of isolation with an artificial, empty smile. Buddhist wisdom never demands that you freeze your heart into a frozen winter wasteland where the longing for connection cannot touch you. It is not an instruction to reject the warmth of human belonging or to pretend that being unseen does not leave a real, piercing chill upon the skin. Instead, it is revealing an inner landscape that is infinitely quieter, a space of profound mercy that changes how we carry our emptiness. It is showing us that the exhausting, hollow ache you are experiencing tonight does not actually reside inside the simple fact of being alone. The true suffering lives in the specific, hyper-vigilant way the mind has chosen to hold that aloneness, turning a temporary season of isolation into a permanent prison of separation. Think of your own life and the invisible borders you have been tracking in the dark before you found the soothing rhythm of this voice. When we experience a moment where we feel misunderstood, left behind by our peers, or entirely dropped by the people we care about, that event occurs in a specific, limited interval of time. It is a passing draft that blows across the ridge of our day. Yet we carry that chill into the darkness of our beds, and we spend our midnight hours trying to use our thoughts like rigid parchment maps, frantically wedging our expectations, our judgments, and our grievances into the open spaces of our lives to keep the world from hurting us again. One of the great insights of the Buddha was that our deepest torment does not grow from the simple, unchosen difficulties that life delivers to our door, but from the heavy, extra layers of resistance that our own ego fastens onto those difficulties. In the foundational path of this wisdom, we learn that the heart is frequently subjected to two distinct injuries. The first wound is what actually happens, the silent phone, the cold interaction, the sudden realization that you are sitting on the outside of a circle where you desperately wanted to belong. This first wound is a real, unavoidable flash of pain. It is the freezing gale striking the ridge. We cannot always control when the mountain winds will shift, nor can we force the people of the valley to open their doors and offer us shelter from the storm. But the second wound is entirely self-made. The second wound is the choice to stand in the open frame and spend days trying to build a frantic paper fortress out of our own resentments and anxieties, using the memory of being unseen as a weapon to convince ourselves that we are fundamentally unlovable, destined to remain forever separate from the human fabric. The first arrow causes a natural pang of grief the second habit turns that grief into a lifelong cage. When we translate these timeless reflections into our modern emotional reality, we can begin to see what attachment and craving truly look like when they operate inside our loneliness. Attachment is not a gentle expression of love. It is the rigid, unyielding posture of the mind that states, "The world must validate my presence exactly on my terms," or "My body is not allowed to relax its shoulders tonight." It is the desperate, silent craving to possess a perfect shield against the vulnerability of being an independent soul, a frantic demand that the external environment must change its shape before we are permitted to drop our defenses. When we crave validation from a world that is currently preoccupied with its own storms, we are behaving exactly like Kalan trying to fight a mountain gale with thin sheets of parchment. The more aggressively we press our rigid expectations into the empty spaces around us, the louder the paper rattles and the more violently the wind tears at our fingers, leaving our hearts bruised by the very boundaries we built to save ourselves. True letting go does not mean that you disappear into nothingness, or that you give up on your deep capacity to care for others, or that you allow yourself to be discarded without consequence. Letting go is simply the somatic realization that the space inside your chest is not an isolated pocket of emptiness that needs to be frantically stuffed with the approval of others. In the deeper current of Buddhist psychology, the illusion of an absolute separation between yourself and the rest of reality is the core generator of all your loneliness. We spend our lives believing that our identity is a tightly sealed box, a fragile interior that must be continuously defended against an invading exterior. But when you look at the decayed wilderness pavilion, you see that when the paper screens fall away, the distinction between the shelter and the wilderness completely evaporates. The air inside the frame is the exact same air that moves the great forest canopy below and holds the moonless sky above. Mindfulness is the ability to stand as that open, wall-less cedar frame, allowing the cold drafts of your day to pass entirely through your ribs without turning the chill into a definition of who you are. Awareness is the quiet, undisturbed space that can notice the heavy presence of isolation without choosing to become the isolation. Right now, in the safety of this dark room, your awareness is infinitely larger than the specific patterns of overthinking that have been pacing the floor of your thoughts. You are fully capable of witnessing the hollow ache in your throat, the tightness in your chest, and the old memory of being forgotten, without allowing those passing waves to dictate the current rhythm of your breath. A thought of being unloved can enter your mind in the dark, but if you do not provide a rigid paper wall for it to strike against, it has nowhere to land. It passes through one side of your awareness and exits the other, leaving the heavy timber of your true nature completely unblemished by its passage. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. When we meet our invisible loneliness with the warmth of genuine compassion, we stop treating our sensitive heart as a broken thing that must be aggressively fixed or hidden away in shame. We can look at our habit of hiding behind our maps and building fortresses not as a personal failure of our character, but as the tired, deeply human attempt of a vulnerable soul trying to find a moment of safety in a world that has often felt unpredictable and cold. We can look at our empty spaces with a soft, forgiving tenderness, recognizing that the gourd only sings because it is completely hollow, just as Master Hobben showed the lonely map maker The storm does not possess a personal hatred for the wood. The gale has no desire to break the shell. The wind is simply moving where it must move. And when the gourd stops resisting the current, the violent assault of the mountain night is transformed into a beautiful, healing melody. The liberating reality of impermanence reminds us that no season of isolation stays fixed unless we spend our vital energy building a fortress to trap it inside our house. Every heavy emotion is a temporary visitor, a passing cloud that has already begun to shift across the high peaks of your life. Your character is not compromised by being alone, and your worth is not diminished because your presence has gone unnoticed by those who cannot see their own hearts. The vast night sky is never broken by the emptiness between the stars, and the ancient ridge remains inherently peaceful, even while the autumn winds strip the leaves from the trees. You are the ridge, not the falling leaves. You are the open space, not the passing storm. In a moment, this journey will guide us into a quiet, physical practice based on the lesson of the hollow gourd, offering your body a gentle pathway to unfasten the remaining scraps of its defenses and breathe in alignment with the wide earth. But before we begin that soft meditation, let your heart rest completely within this single assurance. You do not have to convince anyone of your importance to deserve a soft pillow, a warm blanket, and an undisturbed rest tonight. And this is where the mind begins to soften. If it feels right, let your attention slide completely away from the world of concepts and definitions, allowing your awareness to drop down into the immediate, living landscape of your body as it rests right now. There is no need to evaluate how well you are listening, and there is no standard of perfect peace that you must achieve to be welcome here. We are not setting out to change your state of mind through an act of sheer determination. Instead, we are simply turning our face toward the immediate texture of the night, giving the physical frame permission to step off the highway of the day's obligations. Notice the honest, unyielding weight of your hips, your shoulders, and the back of your head as they sink into the surface beneath you. You do not have to carry your own existence right now. The structure supporting you is entirely capable of holding your fatigue, your isolation, and the unexamined questions of your life without requiring a single ounce of your assistance. Take a slow, completely unhurried breath in through your nose, drawing the cool night air deep down into the very base of your belly, and let it pass through your lips like a soft, quiet sigh, making absolutely no effort to control the space that follows. There is no need to count the seconds of this breath, nor is there any virtue in forcing the air into a rigid, artificial cadence. You might simply notice the gentle expansion of your rib cage, a subtle widening of the spaces between your bones, followed by the slow, effortless deflation that happens when you stop gripping the air. With each quiet exhalation, you might imagine that the outer boundary of your torso is becoming just a little less solid, like ancient wood that has been exposed to the soft dampness of a valley mist, allowing its tight grain to relax its hold on the night. As you lie here in the shadows, you might become aware of one specific memory, one persistent feeling of being separate, or one heavy thought of being invisible that has been asking for your attention tonight. Do not try to violently push this visitor out of your mind, and do not judge yourself for carrying a sense of loneliness into your bed, shaming yourself for feeling isolated is only another way of trying to wedge a rigid map into the posts, adding a fresh friction to a heart that is already profoundly tired. Instead, look at this familiar emotional pattern with a sense of gentle, uncritical curiosity, as if you were observing a weathered object left on a high mountain trail. What does it actually feel like inside the physical borders of your skin when this thought of separation rings through you? Perhaps there is a subtle, cold contraction right in the center of your chest, a heavy tightness in the back of your throat, or a dark, hollow ache in the pit of your stomach. Even noticing these small physical sensations is enough. You do not have to dissolve them or cure them to be safe in this darkness. Perhaps, if it feels right, you might imagine that your own torso is like that ancient thatch-roofed wilderness pavilion standing on the rocky ridge. See the grey, silvered cedar posts of your spine and your ribs standing open and unadorned under the wide sky. For hours, or perhaps for many years, your mind has been frantically trying to paste together a set of paper screens around these posts, attempting to construct a tight, defensive fortress of expectations, judgments, and conditions to block out the coldness of the world. But right now, you can allow those torn, fraying screens to drop away completely into the shadows. You do not have to patch them, you do not have to defend them, and you do not have to repair the borders of your identity tonight. Let the remaining scraps of your self-defense fall away onto the floorboards of your chest, leaving the framework of your being entirely open to the environment. Imagine placing that heavy, persistent thought of loneliness directly into the small, hollow gourd wind whistle that Master Hoban left on the leather case. See the rough, unpolished skin of the gourd, resting within the open pavilion of your awareness. Its interior, entirely empty, except for the specific vibration of the worry you have surrendered to it. You are applying absolutely no force to this object. Your attention is merely a soft, warm hand resting lightly beside it, watching how the wind interacts with its hollow chamber. When the cold breeze of your isolation sweeps across the ridge of your bed tonight, do not try to seal the holes of the gourd, and do not try to squeeze the wood to force it into silence. Just let the draft enter one side of the shell and pass completely through the other, moving directly through the core of your empty spaces, without finding any internal wall to strike against. Notice what happens to the density of your overthinking when you give up the habit of fighting the draft, without the rigid paper boundaries of your resistance to bounce against. The sharp, stinging edge of that loneliness begins to blur and widen in the dark. The memory doesn't break your structure. It simply turns into a deep, hollow melody that vibrates through the cedar posts of your ribs, blending perfectly with the natural vastness of the evening. The thought of being unseen is losing its power to torment you, turning from an invading enemy into a temporary current of air that passes through your chest and spreads out into the open room. You are not destroying the feeling, you are simply giving it so much spaciousness that it can no longer find a tight, defensive corner to suffocate your breath. Perhaps you might realize that when you stop trying to seal your heart away from the night, the terrifying distance between yourself and the rest of the world begins to dissolve on its own. The emptiness around you is no longer a desert that proves you are abandoned. It is the very sky that connects your breathing to the movement of the forest and the slow rotation of the stars. By allowing your torso to remain porous and open, like an old wooden shelter that has outgrown its walls, you let the residue of your day pass completely through your skin without leaving a new wound behind. you can return to this spacious, hollow touch whenever you are ready. There is no penalty for drifting away into the old narratives of your isolation, and no failure if your mind tries to rebuild its paper fortress a few minutes from now. Each time the tightness returns to your throat, you can simply notice the contraction. Let the screens drop and let the wind pass through. Let the image of the ridge pavilion change very slowly now, fading back into the dark, familiar texture of your actual mattress and the soft weight of your blanket, leaving you with nothing but the immediate, physical reality of this present moment. The room around you remains entirely safe and quiet. The world outside continues its slow, unmonitored movement through the dark hours, completely unbothered by the complex boundaries we draw in our thoughts to keep ourselves separate. You do not have to heal your entire life history before you are allowed to sleep, and you do not have to find a human crowd to belong to before your body is permitted to release its tension. True belonging is not a distant shoreline that you must reach through desperate striving. It is the quiet, unconfined space of awareness that has been holding you all along, waiting for you to trust its stillness. In a moment, our journey will return to that high, rocky ridge to discover what happened when the autumn fog grew thicker and how a single, uncarved cedar roof shingle revealed a deeper kind of transformation, a path that shows us how to feel woven into the very fabric of reality without needing the world to applaud our presence. But for now, let yourself rest in this intermediate space where the milestones of your past are losing their sharp outlines and your limbs are becoming beautifully heavy, sinking down into the deep, welcoming stillness of the bed. And this is where the stillness begins to take root. The high mountain fog continued to thicken, its grey, wet blankets drifting slowly between the valleys, turning the ancient cedar forest below into a vast, silent sea of shadows. Several months had passed since Kalen had first sat by the charcoal fire and watched the wind whistle turn this howling storm into a song of deep surrender. He had stayed on the ridge, living in a small wooden outbuilding beneath the main temple, helping Master Hobben gather dry firewood and sweep the fallen pine needles from the stone steps. He had practiced letting his chest become like that wall-less structure, allowing the cold drafts of his daily thoughts to enter and leave without blocking their path. Yet, as the deep winter frosts began to harden the mountain soil, Kaelan discovered that the habit of separation is not dissolved by a single hour of clarity. The mind that has spent a lifetime feeling unseen will always seek out a more subtle, hidden way to build its walls. The mapmaker had fallen into a new kind of quiet torment. Although he no longer tried to fight the mountain winds with his parchment charts, he had become deeply attached to his identity as a solitary observer. He began to take a strange, defensive pride in his isolation, convincing himself that, because he was a wanderer who understood the emptiness of the ridges, he was fundamentally meant to exist on the outside of life. When the local mountain woodcutters or the charcoal burners from the lower valleys came up to the temple to offer grain, Kaelan would quietly retreat into the shadows of the timber pillars. He would watch them share tea and talk about their families, feeling the old, heavy ache tighten his throat. Yet he would tell himself, "I do not belong to that world. My path is the cold sky." He was using the very idea of Zen detachment to build a new, invisible pane of glass between his heart and the human family, turning his pain into a sacred fortress, so he would never have to risk being rejected by reality again. One chilly morning, when the fog was so dense that the edge of the cliff was completely lost in a wall of unmoving white, Master Hobben walked slowly out onto the exposed platform of the pavilion. The old temple keeper was carrying a single, flat, uncarved cedar shingle that had been split from a fresh log, its raw wood smelling strongly of sweet resin and damp earth. Beside it, he laid a small iron mallet and a handful of dark, hand-forged iron nails. He pointed up toward the northern edge of the thatched roof, where the mountain rains had rotted away a small section of the covering, allowing a steady, freezing drip of water to fall directly onto the cold granite floorboards below. Hobben did not offer a long lecture on the nature of connection, nor did he ask Kalen why he had been hiding behind the pillars for weeks. He simply handed the young man the uncarved cedar shingle and the iron mallet, indicating that the hole in the roof must be mended before the heavy winter snows arrived to freeze the timbers. The ladder was old and slick with frost, and as Kalen climbed up into the high, exposed eaves where the roof met the open sky, the biting wind struck his face, making his fingers stiffen with an immediate, defensive chill. He felt entirely alone up in the grey void, surrounded by nothing but a sea of fog, his heart hammering with the familiar desolation of being stranded on the outer edge of existence. He positioned the flat piece of cedar over the rotted gap, lifted the iron mallet, and prepared to strike the first nail. But as he looked down at the wood, he noticed a deep structural problem. The uncarved shingle was completely dry and light, its fresh grain standing out brightly against the dark, weather-beaten timbers of the ancient roof. It looked completely separate from the rest of the structure, an unintegrated fragment that did not match the color, the density, or the age of the pavilion. Kalen hesitated, his mind instantly spinning into overthinking, wondering how this single, raw piece of wood could ever truly belong to a building that had been shaped by 80 years of mountain storms. He felt that if he nailed it down as it was, it would always look like an outsider, a conspicuous scar on the face of the temple. As he stood freezing on the ladder, his hand frozen in mid-air, Master Hobben spoke from the wet stones below, his voice cutting through the thick fog like the slow, resonant striking of a distant bronze bell. Do not try to carve the shingle to match the old wood, Kalen, and do not wait for the sun to dry the roof. Just hold the cedar against the timber and let the mountain touch it. Kalen paused, taking a single slow breath into the base of his abdomen, allowing his shoulders to drop away from his ears. Despite the biting chill of the eve, he stopped trying to figure out how to make the shingle fit, and instead, he simply pressed his bare palm flat against the raw wood, pinning it firmly against the ancient damp frame of the roof. He stood completely still in the center of the white fog, neither striking the nail nor climbing down, choosing for the first time in his life to sit quietly with the absolute uncertainty of the moment. He stopped treating his thoughts of unworthiness as absolute truths and instead turned his entire focus to the immediate physical sensations of his hands against the cedar. As he held the shingle in the silence, a subtle transformation began to unfold before his eyes. The raw cedar did not remain bright and separate. Because the fog was thick and wet, the porous fibers of the fresh wood immediately began to absorb the heavy moisture of the mountain air. Before his eyes, the light, dry grain began to darken, its surface softening as it drank in the cold dampness of the gale, its texture turning from a hard, defensive shield into a deep, heavy state of alignment with the ancient timbers around it. Within an hour of quiet waiting, the shingle had absorbed so much of the mountain's weather that its color had deepened to match the exact silvered gray of the old roof, and it smelled no longer of a separate tree, but of the entire forest canopy below. A profound, wordless realization washed over Kalen, making his breathing long and effortless as he finally drove the iron nail into the wood with a steady, unhurried hand. He realized that the shingle did not have to perform or change its inner nature to belong to the pavilion. It simply had to stop resisting the moisture that was already present in the air. True belonging was not a social circle that he had to force his way into through cleverness or perfection. It was the quiet, somatic alignment of his current presence with the immediate texture of reality. He had been spending his whole life hiding in the shadows because he thought he was too different to be part of the human family. But the river of life did not require him to be anything other than what he was. Kalen climbed down the ladder with a softer, slower stride, his heart no longer treating his loneliness as a permanent identity, but as a temporary mist that was already learning how to blend with the vast night sky. And this is where the mind begins to soften. The deep stillness that enveloped the roof eaves when Kalen let his bare hand rest against the damp cedar is the exact same stillness that is waiting for you right now, within the quiet spaces of your own room. As you lie here in the shadows of the evening, let your awareness settle completely back into the physical reality of your own body, noticing the effortless, unforced rise and fall of your chest against the dark. The external world outside your house may still be filled with unpredictable weather, and your personal history may contain chapters that you wish had been written with a gentler hand. We cannot always reach backward through the river of time to reshape the moments where we felt cast out, or where the coldness of another person's view left us feeling entirely isolated. But we can look directly into the deep, exhaustion-inducing mechanism that has been conducting a silent, relentless trial in your thoughts tonight, and we can choose to change our entire relationship with the emptiness. Have you ever wondered why the mind feels such a compulsive, latent urge to turn its loneliness into a solid identity? Why do we sit in the dark and obsessively trace the spaces where we feel unseen, compiling a detailed record of every person who left us behind, as if building a magnificent monument to our own isolation could somehow keep us safe? We do this because the human ego operates under a profound, universal misunderstanding. It confuses hypervigilant resistance with actual protection. When you experience a moment where you are left out of a circle, or where your presence goes unacknowledged by those around you, a raw, terrifying vulnerability opens up inside your chest. The mind, terrified of being caught unprepared by rejection again, immediately sets to work. It starts to rehearse the future, plotting how it will hide behind the pillars next time, or it replays the past, hunting through every old conversation to find the precise flaw that makes you too different to belong. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. When we examine this defensive pattern through the clear lens of Buddhist insight, we can begin to see the exact mechanism that turns our natural, passing pain into a permanent state of suffering. One of the most liberating realizations of this path is the understanding that there is a vast difference between the first pain that life brings to your door and the second pain that your own mind fastens onto that experience. The first pain is the original event, the quiet phone, the empty space at the table, the freezing mountain gale, that strips the leaves from the autumn trees. This first pain is a temporary, unavoidable phenomenon that belongs to the natural friction of being a sensitive soul in a dynamic universe. We cannot always prevent the fog from rolling over our ridge, nor can we force the world to offer us a constant, flawless stream of approval. But the second pain, the heavy, suffocating wall that keeps you awake tonight, is entirely generated by the mind's refusal to let reality be what it already is. The second pain is the continuous internal commentary that tells you that because you are alone in this room, you are fundamentally broken, cast out of the human circle and destined to watch life from behind a pane of glass. We believe that by using shame as a tool to inspect our flaws, we are somehow working toward our own healing. We treat our sensitivity like a piece of raw wood that must be aggressively carved, chiseled, and hidden away until it is perfect enough to be seen. But this is the ultimate tragedy of self-judgment. Through shame is like trying to dry a roof shingle by putting it in a sealed iron box. It does not integrate the wood, it only splits the grain, hardening your inner landscape until your heart forgets that it is already breathing the very same air that moves the sky. What if the hollow ache you are carrying in your chest tonight is not a structural defect in your soul, but simply a temporary pocket of space that you have been trying to fight with the wrong tools? In our modern lives, we are taught that our worth is determined by how many circles we fit into, how many screens reflect our presence, and how loudly the world applauds our existence. We turn our relationships into a series of borders to be guarded, using our expectations like rigid parchment maps to block out the vast, uncertain expanse of our lives. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us that peace is never found by successfully sealing the wind out of your house. Peace is the radical, quiet willingness to realize that you do not have to become a static, unbreakable monument to be worthy of your place on the earth. You are a dynamic, living system, completely woven into the current moment, changing with every slow breath you draw. True transformation does not happen because you have finally figured out a brilliant argument to prove to the world that you belong. Peace is not the absolute absence of isolation, nor is it a magical state where no one ever leaves your message unanswered again. Peace is an entirely different way of sitting with the emptiness. It begins in the exact second you drop the psychological chisel and stop treating every self-critical thought as an absolute command that you must follow. When an old memory of being forgotten walks into your mind in the dark, you do not have to build a wall around it to keep out the draft. You do not have to plead guilty in the internal courtroom of your overthinking. You can simply stand as the open, wall-less cedar frame, allowing the passing cloud of that feeling to move entirely through your ribs without finding any tight, defensive surface to tear to pieces. You do not have to solve the immense puzzle of your loneliness before you are permitted to let your eyelids become heavy tonight. The deep space within your heart has never been genuinely broken by the silences of your day, just as the inherent stability of the ancient ridge pavilion was never compromised by the wet fog that drifted through its pillars. Your original nature is vast, unconfined, and entirely independent of whether the world chooses to look your way or pass you by in the dark. By choosing to let the remaining scraps of your self-defense fall away onto the mattress, you are not admitting defeat. You are simply refusing to spend your vital heat keeping a phantom alive in your bed. You are giving the rigid borders of your identity permission to turn soft, allowing your presence to blend perfectly with the deep, unmonitored stillness of the evening. Let your whole frame settle into the absolute honest support of the surface beneath you, acknowledging that for this one night you have done enough hiding. There are no critics hiding. In the shadows of this room, there is no tribunal waiting to audit your progress, and there is no ledger requiring you to prove your value before the sun rises. You are completely safe to unfasten the heavy layers of your hypervigilance. Let the small muscles around your jaw release their grip. Let your belly expand with a quiet, unforced spaciousness, and allow your attention to rest entirely on the outer lip of your breath. In a moment, this ancient wisdom will step directly into the small, ordinary details of your daily routine, showing you how to walk through tomorrow's world without treating every empty space as a crisis. But for now, let yourself simply be the quiet mountain ridge that watches the mist move past, a place where the wind can finally run out of boundaries, and this is where the mind begins to soften. Now let this wisdom come closer to your own life, moving out of the quiet ridge pavilion and into the ordinary, daily moments that await you. When the sun rises tomorrow, we often think that ancient insights belong only to remote hermitages, far removed from the digital screens, the constant notifications, and the silent rooms of our modern existence. But the true arena for this softness is not a high mountain. It is found in the middle of a stressful afternoon, during an unsettling interaction with a colleague, or in the quiet panic that arises when a person you care about leaves your message unanswered for hours. These that catch the edges of your day, and it is right here in these unglamorous spaces that you are invited to choose a different way of relating to your internal space. Think of how we navigate our daily routines now, carrying a small, glowing screen in our palms that connects us instantly to the moods, opinions, and silent rejections of the world. When you open your phone and find an empty space where reassurance should be, it acts as a sudden, chilly draft through your thoughts. In the past, your immediate habit might have been to check the device every few minutes, tracking the silence, overanalyzing a single line, or crafting an endless string of mental explanations to guarantee your standing in another person's eyes. This compulsive checking is simply your mind frantically trying to paste up a paper screen, attempting to build a wall against uncertainty out of sheer force of worry. But, as we saw with the hollow gourd, that hypervigilant patching only tightens your focus around the lack, locking the anxiety deep within your muscles while the life right in front of you disappears into a fog of distraction. Perhaps you have spent months or even years walking through the world with a heavy, invisible weight of loneliness resting behind your ribs, while, on the outside, you keep a polite smile fixed upon your face. You may be deeply tired from pretending to be okay, from carrying the exhausting expectation that you must always appear connected, always successful, and always approved of by those around you. When you sit at a desk or stand in a room, nodding along, while your chest feels as empty and cold as an abandoned mountain shelter, you are consuming your own vital energy just to keep your vulnerability hidden from view. You might look at the people around you and assume that their lives are entirely whole, that they never wake up at midnight to audit their own isolation, or that they possess a structural belonging you somehow missed. But everyone you pass on the street is navigating their own hidden currents of separation, running their own internal courtrooms, and exhausting their shoulders by trying to manage the spaces they are terrified to show. Consider what happens when you find yourself lying awake at night, feeling behind in your life, comparing your progress to an invisible map of achievement that someone else invented. The mind begins to run a continuous, painful commentary, asking why you haven't fixed your career yet, why your relationships are still fragile, or why you can't just be content with what is. In these moments, you are treating your own sensitive, complex nature like a raw piece of cedar that must be aggressively carved, chiseled, and hidden away until it fits an artificial standard. You look at your lingering uncertainties and your deep feelings of being separate as proof of a fundamental defect, but your capacity to feel the emptiness is not a design flaw. It is simply the natural sensitivity of an open heart. You do not need to reshape the core of your soul to belong to this earth. You simply need to change where you allow the rim of your mind to rest. Peace is not something you must earn through a lifetime of flawless performance, nor is it a reward that is granted only after you have forced every person in your life to see you clearly. You are fully allowed to rest tonight without earning it. You are allowed to let your eyelids become heavy, even if there are 10 obligations left unfinished, even if a relationship is currently strained, and even if your path forward looks entirely obscured by fog. Practicing a slow breath before you answer an email or check your phone is a form of deep spiritual discipline. It is a quiet choice to let the cedar shingle meet the moisture of the hour, recognizing that not every self-critical thought deserves obedience, and not every anxious feeling is a command that you must follow. You can care deeply about your world without gripping its reactions so tightly that you crush your own breath. Tomorrow, when the first speck of daily dust lands on your schedule, see if you can take a single, unhurried pause before your reactions take the wheel. That brief space is the exact moment the wooden frame opens to the slow, deep current of your current presence. In that pause, you can remind yourself that the memory of being unseen belongs to a season that has already run out of rain. The version of you who stumbled or felt cast out has already dissolved into the current of time. And the person lying in your bed tonight is a new, dynamic being, inherently spacious at the core. By choosing to let go of the need to build walls, you are not denying your human need for connection. You are simply refusing to spend another day using your isolation as a weapon against yourself. You can let go of the extra struggle without disappearing, and you can change without hating the loneliness that brought you here. As the silence of the night expands across your room, notice how the urgency of tomorrow's problems begins to lose its sharp edges when you refuse to provide a rigid wall for them to strike against. The critics you are trying to appease are currently asleep. The future you are trying to predict does not exist anywhere in the material world. There is absolutely nothing you can repair from this bed tonight, and no amount of latter night overthinking will ever clear the road ahead. Let the image of your old rejections turn soft, allowing the heavy weight of your expectations to dissolve into the immense, forgiving undercurrent of the darkness. You have held yourself upright against the wind for long enough. Today you are completely safe now to let the heavy coat slide off your shoulders and trust the quiet gravity of the mattress. And this is where the mind begins to soften. The deep stillness of the high ridge has expanded, far beyond the edges of the story, flowing down from the mountain valleys and settling entirely into the quiet landscape of your bedroom. The damp fog that drifted between the weathered cedar posts of the pavilion has softened every remaining boundary in this room, leaving you wrapped in an atmosphere of absolute, unmonitored safety. Let the rhythm of your breathing become even slower now, a soft, effortless rise and fall that occurs naturally, completely independent of your control or will. The hours of dynamic listening and active understanding have drawn to a quiet close. The words have served their purpose, and the insights are ready to sink deeply beneath the surface of your intellect, planting themselves like silent roots within. Feel how your entire frame has grown beautifully heavy, sinking down into the absolute, honest support of the mattress beneath you. You might imagine that this bed is like that ancient, wall-less pavilion standing open to the vast autumn night. It is a sanctuary of wordless stillness, a place where you are permitted to let go of the control ropes entirely and simply disappear into the restorative darkness. Every microscopic grain of loneliness that you gathered during the daylight hours, every sharp memory of being unseen, and every anxious impulse to prove your worth to a crowded world can simply dissolve into this heavy quiet. The mattress receives the full weight of your vulnerability as fast as you can release it, drawing the residual friction out of your muscles and grounding your heart into the deep rest of the earth. The borders you have been trying so desperately to defend have no solid reality. In this room, they have no voice to accuse you and no hands to hold your posture tight. In this darkness, the illusion of your separation has lost its density, thinning out until it is nothing more than a faint ripple, passing across a silent, midnight ocean. The people who left you out, the rooms where you felt invisible, and the hidden defenses where you trapped your isolation are all completely absent from this space, dissolved by the clean, quiet expanse of the night. You do not have to finish the inventory tonight, and you do not have to find a guarantee of human connection before you are allowed to close your eyes. Let the innermost fibers of your mind soften completely, unfastening the paper screens of your identity, allowing the night wind to pass through your ribs without finding anything to break. Let your eyes rest deeply behind their lids, experiencing the heavy, soothing pressure that blankets your brow, releasing the last subtle layers of hypervigilance from the muscles of your face. Let your jaw drop slightly away from your teeth, allowing your neck and throat to become soft and porous so that your breath moves through you, like the cool night air passing through the open branches of the forest canopy. Your hands are resting completely still beside you, open and uncurled, no longer holding on to the edges of any past rejections, no longer frantically checking the dark corners of your life for a sense of belonging. You are fully permitted to leave the unresolved questions of your life exactly as they are, right now. The universe does not require you to solve your whole existence before the sun rises. Listen closely to the immense quiet that has taken over the darkness, a vast, velvety space that knows no division and holds no judgment. This stillness is not a hollow emptiness that proves you are abandoned. It is the original, undisturbed temple of your own awareness, the sky that remains inherently peaceful, no longer touched by whether the stars are hidden by clouds or shining bright. The seasons of your life may bring drafts or fog, and your human heart may occasionally cause your posture to tighten in self-defense, but those temporary storms can never ruin the vast space that contains them. You are the sky, not the drifting mist. You are the ancient ridge not the falling leaves. You are the quiet wilderness pavilion. After the fire has turned to soft grey ash, and the wood has completely absorbed the moisture of the evening, let the final frequencies of your overthinking decay. Very slowly now, pulsing softer and softer in the dark, the intervals between your thoughts becoming wider, deeper, and increasingly distant. Each slow, exhaling breath carries a tiny fragment of the old boundary out into the open room, diluting the heaviness of your isolation until the feeling runs completely out of density. You do not have to earn your place on this earth tonight, and you do not have to find a crowd to belong to before your body is permitted to release its tension. The world is turning in absolute peace, carrying you forward through the midnight hours without your effort, allowing the vast night sky to hold you while your spirit rests. Trust the darkness to restore you. Trust the quiet gravity that is pulling you down into the soft, unmonitored waters of a deep, heavy sleep. There is absolutely nothing left to examine, nothing left to carve, and nothing left to protect within the quiet chamber of your chest. The screens have been taken down. The cedar has matched the greyness of the storm, and the wind has passed through without leaving a single scratch behind. Let yourself slide completely over the lip of wakefulness, dropping down into that absolute, weightless stillness where names lose their shapes and the self dissolves into the rest. What if the home you have been looking for all these years was never hidden in the warmth of a distant village, but was quietly breathing right here, inside the very emptiness you finally stopped trying to seal out?